Kind of a weird exercise to start this video. I want you to imagine aliens came from outer space. The Monstars from Space Jam. You guys remember that one? They actually show up. And they're kind of grumpy guys, and they're a little uncomfortable where they are, but they hear people talking about joy. People keep using the word joy around them. And one of them walks up to you and says, "Hey, what's this joy that everybody keeps talking about?" How would you explain the concept? Joy is a little tough, I think, because a lot of times it's something that you experience more than it's something you can point to, right? Is there a joy thing you do? Last week, in our video series talking about the fruit of the Spirit from Galatians 5, we talked about love. And really, the big point was that love is not something that you feel, it's something that you do, it's something that you live, it's something you give. Joy, you can share joy with other people, but it's also not like, here, let me do this joy thing for you. Whereas love is like, here, let me do this loving thing for you. So how do you explain an experience like joy? Well, let's just back up a little bit and think about where joy comes from. And maybe that's more relevant anyways, as opposed to trying to explain what it is. Maybe talking about how it works and where it comes from, and maybe that'll lead us to an answer. I think maybe you yourself or maybe people you know and friends you have, think about joy sometimes in terms of something that's very momentary, right? You eat a delicious dessert that you haven't had in a really long time. Summertime, maybe it's you get some nice watermelon, you get some homemade ice cream or like some pie or something, you eat it, like that feeling, you're like, that's joy. Well, that doesn't really help because that's going to be different and very subjective from person to person. But anyway, maybe that's one way you think about it, but then that also feels kind of off, because if that's joy, man, that means that my joy as a human being can melt as soon as a bowl of ice cream goes away. That's tough. And that's not something that, well, it's not very good joy, if that is joy. Maybe it is, but maybe it's not. So sometimes we maybe mistakenly think about joy as a momentary kind of thing. Another problem is we'll think about joy in terms of our circumstances. I had joy when we had that party and a bunch of my friends came over and we all had a great time and did karaoke and laughed our heads off. Well, that's good. That was fun. But if that's what joy is, then that means some people can never have joy. Like, it's just not possible. It's not possible for people who are starving to death to have joy. It's not possible for people who lose the love of their lives to have joy. It's not possible because their circumstance prevents them from having joy, if that's where joy comes from. All right, are you having trouble yet thinking about joy and trying to explain it? There's a book of the Bible, the book of Philippians, that was written by the Apostle Paul. Same guy who said the fruit of the Spirit is love and joy. He wrote the book of Philippians. And the book is filled with statements of Paul's joy. He has joy. He tells his readers, you guys should be rejoicing. But the weird thing is where Paul was writing from whenever he had all this joy. At the top of the book, it becomes pretty clear that Paul's in prison. And not because he committed a crime, but because he was doing good things for God. He was preaching the gospel. And yet he specifically says, even though I'm in prison for Jesus, I'm still rejoicing. Not only that, but people outside the prison were bad-mouthing Paul, basically saying, like, maybe he was in there for bad reasons or whatever. They were speaking ill of him or making him look bad. And Paul says, well, they're jerks, yeah, but Jesus is getting preached, so I'm still rejoicing. And then later on, he actually says there's a good chance that I'll die, but you know what? I still rejoice. What a weirdo, right? And some of you may be watching this thinking, okay, well, this guy's clearly disturbed. Like, something's wrong with this guy mentally and emotionally. Maybe. Or maybe he had found a secret to joy that the rest of us miss out on. In Philippians chapter 4, at the end of that letter, Paul comes to it and he's actually thanking the Philippians. The whole point of the book of Philippians, by the way, is a thank you note. They had sent him some supplies while he was in prison to encourage him. It's not like prison now where you can't send stuff to people. Back then, that was the only way you survived, is if you had friends who would help you out while you were in house arrest or in prison or whatever. And as he wrote to them, he said, listen, I really appreciate it. Not that I needed the gift, honestly. He says, because I've learned to get along with humble means, and I've learned how to get along with lots of stuff. And I've learned in whatever circumstance I am to be content. By the way, maybe contentment is a really close cousin to to the idea of joy. But anyway, to explain his joy, to explain his contentment, to explain his sense of steadiness and positive outlook on his life, he says this: I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. That's if you know a Christian, or if you are a Christian, you probably have seen or know or have some sort of Christian artwork. Maybe it's the background of your phone, maybe it's something in your house or whatever, and it says, I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. And probably if you're not a Christian, you've heard that kind of language before, or you've seen an athlete have a tattoo or something on their shoe or whatever. You know this is something that people talk about. But I want you to understand the context and the point. The strength that Paul had was not to, overcome political forces or to have success in business ventures or whatever. The strength that Paul is talking about is the strength to have joy in spite of your momentary circumstances. And the reason for Paul's joy then was not because of what was happening in that moment, but because of the relationship that he had with Jesus. Now, some of you are sitting there, especially if you're not a Christian, maybe you don't even believe in the gospel at all, and you're saying, this is so dumb. Jesus is dead. How can you have a relationship with that person? Well, let's table that for just a second, okay? Can you at least concede that the deepest and greatest and truest joys that people have are in their relationships? Relationships dictate our joy. And part of the reason I know that is because how unhappy people are when they don't have healthy relationships. You've seen this in messed up marriages. You see this in tense families. You see this in workplaces with people who don't like each other and don't have strong relationships. You see this in communities where there's ethnic or economic tension. Strong relationships create joy. Fractured relationships eliminate the possibility of joy. Relationships are really the basis of joy, but here's the problem. Every single person, and some of you, probably every one of you, have somebody who you're like, I have joy because of this person. They don't always give me joy, but I have it because of this person. Here's the deal. At some point you won't. At some point that person will let you down. At some point that person will betray you. At some point that person will have to move or leave, or they'll get other friends that'll push you out of their circle further out to the edge. Or at some point, every person will die. And so this one thing that really gave you joy, your relationships, they go away. The reason why a relationship with Christ can give you true joy is because he never goes away. He died, yes, but he was raised from the dead, never to die again. And now his joy is made complete in us. We share in his joy with the Father, and he shares his joy with us so that we can have his joy within ourselves because of the relationship that we share with him. And in that way, if you can come to believe that Jesus was raised from the dead and he rules in heaven, and however strange that may be to you, or maybe it's not strange to you, if you'll embrace that notion that he is alive and that he's living to draw you into himself, and if you'll deepen a relationship with him, no moment will take away your joy. No circumstance will crush your joy. It'll never melt away. It'll grow stronger and stronger now and forever. You'll bear the fruit of the Spirit, joy in a relationship with Christ.